At the end of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles left the once mighty High Seas Fleet a shadow of its former self, and shortly thereafter the Imperial Russian fleet ended up at war with itself and various Western powers during the Soviet Revolution. And in the aftermath of all that, the execution or persecution of much of the Russian nobility, who had traditionally made up much of the officer class, meant that what was left of the Russian fleet was neither especially large or especially well led. This left the Swedish Navy blinking in mild surprise as it was suddenly handed the mantle of most powerful fleet in the Baltic once again. However, since Kalmar Union II Flatpack Empire was not in the minds of the Swedish government at the time, they instead used the sudden change in fortune to make an excuse to cut the naval budget dramatically instead. This state of affairs lasted for just over a decade until the mid-1930s when everyone started rearming, and that included Sweden, which was building a number of new destroyers. However, the depleted Swedish defence industry could only build so fast, and when the Soviets went after Finland, aka Eastern Sweden, alarm bells began to ring. It seemed some emergency war material was urgently needed. But it was now 1939, and everyone who might typically sell ships, planes, or tanks was fully committed to orders for their home countries and had no spare space on their production lines for more external orders. Except that is for Italy, who were quite happy to sell anyone anything as long as you didn't serve carbonara pizza at a diplomatic function. And so, 3 months after the start of World War II, a Swedish delegation made its way gingerly past the rest of Europe to talk to the still technically uninvolved Italians about a large purchase of mines, a Swedish favourite, torpedoes, which were like mines except they could move around under their own power, motor torpedo boats, for carrying the torpedoes around, and destroyers, which could carry both torpedoes and mines in happily larger quantities. 4 Mars boats were purchased and duly shipped back to Sweden as deck cargo, MAS 506, 508, 511 and 524, which were redesignated to T11, 12, 13 and 14 in Sweden. After some negotiations, the Italians also agreed to part company with 2 of their older Sella-class destroyers. At just under 1,000-ton displacement, they were themselves a little closer to large torpedo boats by this stage of proceedings, but their small size and shallow draft appeared to suit Swedish purposes well. The 2 ships selected were the Bettino Ricasoli and Giovanni Nicotera, which were of course renamed to the Pake and Psilander, respectively. Also purchased were 2 ships that were definitely classed as torpedo boats, the Spica and the Astore. These were, however, a decade newer, and although they displaced a little bit less, they were marginally faster and somewhat better armed for a modern environment. These were renamed to Romulus and Remus. But they were all far too large to stick on the deck of a freighter, and so they would have to be sailed to their new homes. Thus, while the 4 new ships were moved to the fitting-out docks at La Spezia to be made ready, 425 men to crew them were placed on the passenger liner Patricia, which was sent from Sweden after having been commandeered into naval service, with the intention that it would also act as a kind of mothership on the way back, as well as carrying all the spare parts and ammunition that had come with the deal for the ships, plus all the extra torpedoes and mines that had been purchased separately. Since there was no way the small craft would actually make it to Sweden with their existing fuel capacities, the tanker Castor was also dispatched, heading to Lisbon to act as a fueling point. The plan was to sail with a mixed Italian and Swedish crew all the way to Lisbon to help the latter get familiar with their ships. Then the Italians would go home, and the small flotilla would head up via the English Channel across the North Sea and to Gothenburg, with Commander Torsten Hagman in charge. But then the so-called phony war, or Sitzkrieg element of World War II came to a rather dramatic end, and with that came the German occupation of Norway and Denmark, as well as the German advance into Belgium and the Netherlands. And this meant the risk of the ships being attacked by mistake as they passed the active war zone at the eastern end of the Channel was considered far too great, and the ships would have to be rerouted around the UK and then down through the North Sea. Due to the increasing levels of Italian belligerence towards the Allies, it was also decided that the Swedish crews would have to go it alone right from the start of the voyage. Everything was kept as secret as possible, and indeed the first the wider world knew of things was when the formation showed up at Cartagena in Spain on the 21st of April, after Puque had temporarily lost power and collided with Psilander. During their first leg at sea, however, the British had occupied one of their planned stopover points, the ostensibly up till this point Danish Faroe Islands, since with the invasion of Denmark the Royal Navy didn't want the islands to be used as a safe haven for U-boats. This would be important later. With repairs completed, the formation made its way to Lisbon to refuel from the Castor, leaving that city on the 26th of May, heading for Cove in Ireland. Castor's top speed was slower than the economical cruising speed of the rest of the formation, so she was told to sail independently, and they'd all meet up again in the Emerald Isle. On the 2nd of June, the destroyers and the Patricia arrived, the latter taking aboard a number of Swedish citizens who decided they wanted to go home. But while they waited and waited, there was no sign of the Castor, and no oil available for sale in Cove, so the Patricia had to improvise fuel transfer lines to top off the destroyers, and they all headed for the Faroes. What had transpired was that a French cruiser had come across the Castor and, being suspicious of a lone tanker making its way around the Allied-held areas, had put a prize crew aboard her and ordered her into Casablanca for inspection. Although she was released after a couple of days, she was now far behind schedule. By the 19th of June, the liner and the destroyers had arrived at Torhaven in the Faroes, setting anchor in the Skalla fjord to await the arrival of the much-delayed tanker. And so you can imagine their surprise when, the next morning, instead of the Castor, the much more threatening shapes of 3 tribal-class destroyers, Tartar, Maori and Mashona, arrived at the entrance to the fjord and began to train their guns on the Swedish ships. Any one of the large British destroyers outgunned pretty much the entire formation, and Commander Hagman wondered what on earth was going on. Castor finally rocked up later that day, but she was ordered to anchor separately by the British. Answers to the situation came in the form of Captain Caslin, commander of the 6th Destroyer Flotilla, who boarded the Puque via boat coming from the Tartar. He informed Hagman that the ships were being seized to prevent them falling into German hands. The crews were to be taken to the UK but would then be allowed to return home from there, and Hagman was forbidden from using his radios to tell anyone about what was going on. Since the Patricia was full of ammunition, and the only guns that could be brought to bear at this point were a couple of 4-inch guns on the aft deck of the Remus, Hagman was in no immediate position to argue the point. The British stated they were invoking the Rite of Angari, which wasn't some strange ritual centred around a particularly surly bloke from down the road. It was, in fact, an ancient bit of international law that went back to before the medieval period, but it essentially said that in the event of war, any property belonging to a neutral third party that happened to be in the territory of one of the belligerent parties could be seized or destroyed in order to deny its use to the enemy, although appropriate compensation may need to be made. The British were themselves worried that the Germans might try to use exactly the same right as the Swedish ships passed through or near Norwegian or Danish waters, and they just decided to get there first. Initially, despite his rather disadvantageous position, Hagman was tempted to refuse the British orders and then return fire or scuttle his ships, but he decided to consult with the other senior officers, asking for a copy of the British orders in writing in order to buy time. Given that his ships had barely any fuel or water aboard, and with the risk to the civilians aboard the powder keg that was the Patricia, plus the admittedly rather anemic display of defiance that the Remus's aft guns could give, any resistance, it was concluded, was far more likely to injure the Swedes than the British, and so the commanding officers by majority advised that resistance was probably not in the best interests of anyone, and so he met with the British again and agreed, albeit under protest, to most of their terms, although he did insist that the crews be allowed to board the Patricia rather than be taken to the UK. This was agreed, and the British ships moved in to deploy boarding parties to the destroyers, whereupon they found out just exactly how short of fuel and water the ships were, plus also discovering a few minor acts of sabotage carried out by the departing crew. It was initially decided that Psilander and Romulus would be left in place with caretaker crews, while Bouquet and Remus would be sailed to Scapa Flow the next day. And so at 20 minutes past 6 on the 21st of June, Maori and Mashona left to lead the way. Since Castor and Patricia were not part of the seizure order, they were allowed to leave later in the afternoon, and as soon as they got into international waters, Hagman radioed home to let Sweden know what had happened. He was informed that, rather ironically, around the time the British crews had been settling into their new assignments, the Germans had in fact assured the Swedes, for whatever the Nazi government's word was seen to be worth at that stage of proceedings, that they weren't going to interfere with the destroyer's voyage past Norway and Denmark. An hour after the Swedish liner and tanker had left, the British decided that they'd deciphered enough of the Swedish and Italian instruction documents to get Bouquet and Remus going, and Tartar sailed with them in company. That night, Castor and Patricia were ordered to turn around by Stockholm and head back to the Faroes to demand the release of the destroyers. Their main argument centred around a previous safe passage guarantee that the British had granted before the ships had even left Italy. Of course, by the time they got back, there were only 2 of the 4 destroyers left in harbour. Meanwhile, at sea, the Bouquet had decided to break down and was causing no end of fun as the British tried to corral her and get her under tow. A tug that was nearby tried, but crashed into her, and so eventually a trawler had to be summoned instead until another, larger and more powerful tug could arrive from Scotland. Back at Torhaven, the Swedes argued that the Faroes were in fact neutral territory, not belligerent. The British pointed out that since they'd been in nominal charge of the islands for about a month, it thus counted as British for the purposes of the right of Angari. And with the return of the Patricia and the Swedish crews, the Mashona was summoned back to stop them trying to take back Psilander and Romulus by force. On the 24th of June, the latter 2 destroyers made sail for the UK thanks to the additional crews who had been lent by the passing battleships Rodney and Valiant. But later in that same day, the British government decided they would in fact release the ships back to Sweden to avoid a diplomatic row from escalating and potentially pushing the Swedes closer to the Germans. Of course, by this point, all the destroyers were now at sea again, and so the crews aboard the Patricia were informed that, yes, they could have their ships back, but it was going to be a collection-only deal, so they better get a move on for Scotland. And so a steady stream of Swedish ships began to arrive at the agreed collection point of Kirkwall. The Psilander and Romulus showed up on the 26th, the Bouquet and the Remus, which had gone to Scapa, on the 29th, and finally the Patricia on the 30th, with the formal handover of the ships conducted on the 2nd of July. Unfortunately, the prize crews seemed to have taken the minor sabotage and the frankly awful voyage that they'd suffered on the way to Scotland rather personally, and it was found that pretty much every loose item aboard had been stolen, which meant some more time spent in Kirkwall as the British dockyards made good all the damage, which was of course done for free, along with an apology note and £1,000,000 krona in compensation, which was about £58,000, or the price of a cheap Flower-class corvette, according to some estimates. With this handover accomplished, the destroyers, the Patricia and the Castor, all headed for Sweden on the 5th of July, only to be accidentally bombed 3 days later by British aircraft, which had assumed that anything that wasn't flying the White Ensign but near Norway would be hostile. Luckily, no hits were scored on the Swedish formation, and remarkably, when they stopped in Norway to refuel again, the Germans did in fact leave them alone, and they finally managed to make it to Gothenburg on the 10th of July, as the Germans had apparently decided that continued Swedish iron ore shipments were worth considerably more than 4 small destroyers, even in the aftermath of the battles of Narvik. Now you might ask, as did the Swedes at the time, why exactly did the British seize the ships, having previously granted them safe passage, and why, once they'd been seized, did they decide to return them again so quickly? One explanation seems to be the timing of the whole thing. When the ships had been purchased and assurances sought on the sailing plan, which is where the safe passage guarantee came from, Germany was still confined to its invasion of Poland and a bit of back and forth at the French border. But by the time the ships sailed, at least from a British perspective, Germany had abused Norwegian territorial waters before then invading Norway and Denmark physically, plus they'd begun to advance westwards, and of course the Kriegsmarine had lost a lot of its destroyers in these efforts. This in turn made it seem far more likely that the Germans would now want the Swedish ships, to at least partially make up for their recent losses. And the Germans were also in a much better position now to seize them, since they controlled the Skagerrak Channel, or at least the western end of it where it entered the North Sea, and where the ships would have to enter the channel in question. Shortly after the formation had arrived in Lisbon, the Foreign Office had actually advised the Swedes against continuing their voyage and suggested they just stayed in Lisbon instead, although since this was only advice, the Swedes could of course choose to disregard it, which they had. The advice had been issued on the grounds that the Royal Navy was already concerned about the possibility of the Germans seizing the ships later in the voyage, although these concerns formed the basis as to why the Foreign Office sent the advice. They didn't actually include that bit in their actual message. And thus, when it became clear that the Swedes had not heeded the British advice, and nor had the ships stopped in Ireland, but were instead continuing their voyage and heading for the Faroes, which was the last place they'd be easily accessible to the Royal Navy, it was decided, in something of a snap decision, that it was better safe than sorry, and so orders were issued on the 19th to seize the ships the next day. What seemed to have then caused the change of heart was a visit subsequently from the Swedish ambassador in London, who'd pointed out that the seizure of the Swedish destroyers would be seen by the Germans as a sign of Swedish inability to maintain its neutrality, and that might result in an invasion of Sweden on the same ostensible grounds as those the Germans had given for the invasions of Norway and Denmark, namely their alleged inability to withstand pressure from the British, especially in light of the guarantees of safe passage and escort through the various minefields that had been offered by the Germans. The British responded at that meeting that they had no knowledge of any guarantees from the Germans, which was fair because the Germans had only given them, as we've seen, on the day after the destroyers had actually been seized, although to be clear, they didn't know the destroyers had been seized. But the British also pointed out that even if they had knowledge of these guarantees, they probably wouldn't trust them anyway. However, there were also reports from the tribals who'd been involved on the age, size, and condition of the quartet of ex-Italian vessels, which began to raise questions about whether potentially compromising Swedish iron ore shipments in exchange for such ships would really be worth it for the Germans, and conversely if 4 ships of relatively limited utility were worth ruining Anglo-Swedish relations over. Initially, the War Cabinet made the decision to still keep the ships, but to offer Sweden compensation immediately for their seizure. But then further reports came, both from overseas about growing discontent in Sweden as news of the seizure spread, coupled with the miserable reports coming in about the ship's seaworthiness in North Sea conditions, which the Royal Navy's prize crews were experiencing firsthand as the first 2 ships made for Scotland, and this caused a change of plan, and the decision came to release the ships instead, at least pending some assurances about other consignments of weapons and aircraft that the Swedes had ordered from other countries in order to prevent those from potentially being seized en route by the Germans as well. With all of that sorted out, the entire affair was over, and, given wartime secrecy and the potential embarrassment over the entire thing, it was just largely not mentioned any further and allowed to drift out of most people's memories, if they knew it had happened at all in the first place. The Swedes, for their part, would actually discover pretty much the same thing the Royal Navy's prize crews had. The older Puke and Psilander turned out to be fragile and roll very heavily in rough waters, needing extensive refits to be even marginally suitable for operations in the Baltic, and so they only actually saw a few years of active service before being placed in reserve by their grateful crews in late 1943 or early 1944. They were decommissioned entirely in 1947, and then used as targets before being scrapped in 1949. But the newer Romulus and Remus, although smaller, proved somewhat more suited for Swedish uses, and they were actually kept in service until the late 1950s, with several upgrades along the way, before also being scrapped at the start of the 1960s. Although interestingly, they actually outlasted their erstwhile captors, as Mashona and Maori would be lost to air attack in 1941 and 1942 respectively, while Tata did survive the war but was sold for scrap as completely worn out in early 1948. But the first and last ships in this tale to go were actually the auxiliaries. The Castor was on its way from the then still neutral USA to Gothenburg with a cargo of fuel in March 1941 when she was torpedoed and sunk by U-46 east-southeast of Greenland, taking 15 of her crew with her, the 21 survivors being rescued by a passing British merchantman. But at the other end of things, the Patricia, although never returning to her days as a liner, would be used as a submarine depot ship by the Swedish Navy for decades to come, only being scrapped in the early 1970s.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.